Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with Dawn James. Given Dawn's broad background, we cover a range of different topics as part of our conversation. As well as being a best-selling author, which I've linked in the show notes for those interested, Dawn is a leader in business transformation, strategic leadership, and risk and compliance management. We dive into a conversation about how companies really need to think about their carbon management and ESG strategies beyond just the compliance, but also in terms of the opportunities that exist. And we also talk about how company culture plays such a pivotal role in terms of carbon management adoption within companies. Dawn focuses on company culture as part of her book. And so she talks about the importance of environmental leadership for this adoption that we need to see. Finally, we talk about the role of clean tech and AI. Dawn talks about how she believes AI is an effective tool and also some of the really exciting projects that she's working on in the clean tech space. If you enjoy our conversation, please like the podcast. And if you want to stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you subscribe to the feed. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dawn. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today, I have the privilege of being joined by Dawn James. Dawn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure.
I'm really excited to chat to you because we have a little bit of a different background. And so you're coming at this kind of carbon and emissions conversation from a very different perspective than me. Can you, for our listeners and stuff, can you just give a little bit of your background and a little bit of some of the work that you do for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to a great conversation. So I am a geoscientist turned executive strategist. Prior to my work currently, I worked as a strategist for Microsoft and a sustainability strategist for Deloitte. Now I'm founder and managing principal of my own boutique consulting firm, Sustainability and Leadership and Training, SLT for short. And I also work as a fractional executive. So I'm interim executive director at CLI, Clean Energy Leadership Institute. I am actually a Amazon best-selling author as well. I written the updraft of that, and it's a playbook for folks navigating complex systems, careers, and dealing with change. My consulting firm focuses on sustainability, go-to-market, and commercialization. I do a lot of work with decarbonization roadmaps, data center energy strategy. I work with organizations around their workforce transformation, and I do a ton of board work and advisory work. I would say that some of my current projects that I'm excited about now is I do work, like I mentioned, workforce and skills strategy for a clean manufacturing company. I also have been doing digital solutions and go-to-market work for a solar industry company. And then I also build out business plans and market growth strategy for a decarbonization platform organization. And then, like I mentioned, I have a couple of startups specifically in the hydrogen and microgrid space where I'm an advisor, strategic advisor for those companies.
Which is awesome. So many things. There's so much for us to pull apart. Before we dive in, though, we will put links for everybody, both for your consulting firm and also for your book. I know you and I have talked about this before, and it's amazing. Congratulations. So
Thank you so
we'll make
much.
sure we link that in the show notes for everybody who wants to get their hands on a copy of that because it's a huge accomplishment. So, yeah, well done. You talked about really helping companies with strategy and around sustainability, which I think is amazing because conversation, particularly in the US, has changed a lot around sort of compliance versus opportunities and things like that. Like, how do you see, some of this conversation evolving? There was obviously a proposal out by the SEC to have corporate reporting for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. That's now on hold. So then how are companies kind of navigating that? Are you still seeing companies getting ready for that, or are they shifting? Like, what's going on? How are you even approaching some of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you can imagine, the conversation has shifted quite a bit in the last, let's say, 7 months. or so. However, most organizations, especially that I worked with at Deloitte and at Microsoft, these large kind of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, these are big shifts, right? So it's difficult for these organizations to, 100% change their strategy in such a short period of time. So from companies that I've seen, um, let's say most of the companies that I work with, they don't just operate in the vacuum of the United States, right? So looking at what SEC's climate disclosures look like, whether it's paused or what was proposed, what I'm saying is that it's not gone, right? Yes, there's parts of the SEC climate rules that were paused, and we definitely have this kind of murky space of timelines. But I'm also saying that companies are sort of still moving in the direction that they were going in previously, right? So they're not making any sort of big adjustments or big changes. Um, and I think that part of this is because of investors wanting to have useful decision-making levers, and being able to have audible climate data alongside their financials. Those facts have not changed, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I'm saying that my clients are still staying the course, and they're still in that staying the course. They're still trying to understand and lock in some of their baselines around scope 1 and scope 2. They're really still looking at the quagmire of underlying data in this space, so like in the energy space, if I think about like meter data, invoices, utilities, fuels, right? Like documenting all of these things, that's still kind of a data suck for some companies. And then also really assigning control over all of these numbers, and being able to pull off some very trustworthy assurance pilots. Right. So those are the things that I was working on quite heavily, I would say, up until last year. Um, and so companies, what I found was that they're not wanting to be caught flat-footed, right? So that was where they were last year. And so many companies were building out that data assurance. They were making those decisions around governance and risk. And then companies like we're kind of talking about a little bit, companies that have assets outside the United States, they also were looking at the different CFRD and the sort of things that they're doing over in Europe, double materiality, those type of things.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, looking at supply chain, right? So that's a whole nother
That's a
kind of
whole that's a whole can of worms.
that's
Yeah.
a whole other thing, but that is part of really getting your audit data ready, is having all of, like, so if we just look at like supplier contracts, and really starting to wrap your head around what does this look like from our scope 2, and being able to improve our scope 3 estimates, right? Getting some tighter data around that stuff. And again, the reason that I'm seeing that, over a year ago, and that still is keeping companies stay the course, is that there is a financial risk in not having these things in order.
No,
So from
makes
investors,
sense.
Wall Street, companies' valuation on the market, not having this part of your business in order, impacts your financials and your ability for that internal audit.
That really makes sense. Because I was going to ask you about the investor piece. You already talked about, like, for companies with assets in Europe and
Mhm.
other parts of the world, we've seen a lot of other countries stand up reporting and for scope 3 as well, not just scope 1 and scope 2 like the SEC was proposing, but the investment community and what that looks like is something that I'm continuing to still hear a lot of noise about as well, is that there is still pressure by financial institutions on these companies to disclose, to understand what it looks like. And really, yeah, I liked how you talked about it in terms of risk. Like it is, so I don't know if there was anything else in that space, but it is that you wanted to comment on. But I think that risk piece for companies is something that we keep hearing, I definitely keep hearing in my work a lot about of just what does that liability look like and what does that future risk look like? So interesting that you're also seeing that the investors are also pushing for some of that as well. So,
Yeah, and that's something that I'm hearing, and that's something that I'm seeing, and I'm seeing that as being why companies, I don't want to say this in like a bad way, but why companies care,
hmm,
right? And then this is also when I think when we were talking before, I was telling you a little bit around sustainability strategy and some of the things that I help clients with. That's the crux of this strategy is how do we turn sustainability into something that is not a nice to have, not something that is, a revenue suck, or sometimes organizations feel that it is more philanthropic,
yeah.
where we look at it as where we reframe it as an opportunity, right? And that comes with reducing financial risk, right? That's one of the legs on that table is
That makes sense. So, I mean, let's talk about that a little bit because I think for so many companies that I have worked with and seen and talked to who are a little bit skeptical about, opportunities in this space, a lot of them just see it as, burden in terms of, regulatory burden and therefore cost and some of that kind of stuff. Like, other than sort of this conversation around liability and risk, like how else are you seeing companies really looking at the opportunities in this space to really set out their decarbonization and carbon management strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's different ways I've seen companies do it. I think that there is a bit of a strategy framework that some companies are using. It just depends on I don't want to say again, I don't want to say things in a negative way, but how smart organizations are about leveraging this either like the compliance space or understanding sustainability as a real growth lever, right? And part of that is, treating carbon like currency, right? And thinking about it as a cost in, cost out type of thing. So like you can think about some of the costs out for, carbon intensity reduction, that sort of thing is, efficiency upgrades, shaving your shifting or shaving your peak demand management, that type of thing, or being smarter with your procurement, right? And some companies were looking at it, their renewable energy strategy, whether they're going to bring on-site renewables. I think of some of the hyperscalers that are doing their data centers, their storage plans, their energy storage plans, and then having this 24/7 carbon aware idea of like what is happening 24/7 with their business, that where carbon is a supply issue, right? Where supply where they are aware of how many emissions are coming off of their particular assets, right? And so once you're able to kind of start understanding the parts in your portfolio, like who owns what are your targets, and then how much cash you're spending on these different things, then you can start looking at these different levers for growth opportunities,
I
right?
love
So
that. Yeah.
so then, like, for instance, like coming up with a very robust and credible and audible and assurance ready decarbonization plan will win you RFPs, right?
Mm.
It's one thing, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing that like customers are screening suppliers on their emissions, right? So I have clients that have gone through their, kind of supplier contracts, and they're looking at those contracts for emissions, for low carbon intensity products, that sort of thing. So you could actually get either price premiums or preferential status
Mm.
in selling into a company that is, carbon aware, like I mentioned, is, having carbon aware
Yeah.
workflows, frameworks, where they're going to only, or they're going to prioritize their vendors or their customers within their supply chain that have some sort of emissions plan, right? So that's part of it. And then also, one thing that I'm seeing as a thing that helps companies to be valued higher is having resilience across their supply chain, across assets, right? So if they have critical facilities, if they have data centers, if they're a hospital, if they're a manufacturer, right? Being able to have some sort of resilience plan plays a big role. So whether they're leveraging microgrids, whether they're using different types of renewables and storage is a big one. The companies that have that are using these batteries for storage, there's a bunch of them out there. There's a bunch of startups that are doing some really great work, and then also that are able to leverage flexible loads. Right, I've
Okay.
seen that these companies are able to, unlock some of these higher SLAs. They're able to unlock more partnerships. They're able to have more participation in how they're dealing with demand response. So there's a bunch of different kind of use cases
Yeah.
beyond that, but they can turn some of this like cost out that you're thinking of for that where people are like, oh, having to come up with decarbonization plan just means that I am spending money. You could actually turn these into growth levers.
Yeah, I love that. And there's some really tangible kind of examples that you've gone through there. Like one of the things that I think is really important, and I know you talked about at the top, it's something you've done a lot of work with, but like trying to then get almost every single person in the organization to think about their supply chains and carbon and all this kind of stuff takes a whole transformation of the workforce. Like, I know it's something you're really passionate about, but talk a little bit about how you help companies on their workforce strategy and the transformation of the workforce and the importance of that in really developing that skill set within companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that so I built out a workforce strategy for a company not too long ago. And I think that we're in a very interesting time from a technology standpoint, from a generational standpoint, you know. But I also when I talk to younger folks and people in the workforce, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space as well, right? And so, companies are running against some of these blockers, like being able to upskill the workforce for the transition that we're seeing in technology. So I think that's like one of the biggest things that I'm seeing is just this race to upskill,
Mm.
right? Being able to really look at across an organization's business from operators, buyers, finance, and sales space, being smart about what's happening, not only kind of geopolitically, but also within a particular sector, and being able to move and be flexible with the changes. I'm purposely saying that this isn't an AI problem, right? I'm going to purposefully say that, right? Because there are a lot of front office, I'm not going to say back office, front office work that can only be done by humans, right? And for that, we need to make sure that our workforce is smart about that. The other thing that I would say is, kind of when we're thinking through some of this workforce transformation and even more so leadership culture, there's a lot of things kind of happening in the world today, but creating psychological safety. I think before we even came on, I was talking about some of the new kind of buzzwordy things that are kind of happening in our culture around what's happening in our workforce. But being able to create a broad leadership coalition and create psychological
Safety.
safety, I think that is where our true like creative nature kind of comes from, like really being able to surface ideas from the edge, to be able to celebrate our wins, and also to be able to create like true kind of programs that work for the many, not for kind of the few in a narrow kind of way of thinking.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things that I talk about, I mean, this is something that we've all kind of heard, but like, culture eats strategy for breakfast. We hear that all the
Yep.
time.
I've
Um,
definitely heard that a lot. Yeah.
I think like when we start thinking about change management and what's going to be required over the next couple of years, we can also say things like tech doesn't adopt itself,
Mm.
right? So, I talk a lot about AI, and I recently wrote an article about how there's a big reason why AI adoption isn't going widespread inside these and most organizations. I have yet to go into an organization where AI back office, implementation is completely ubiquitous. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. And a big part of that is because tech doesn't adopt itself, right?
Yeah.
People, right? So you have to have people that, one, they trust the tech. And I'm not talking about just the frontline workers or people using the tech. It's also the leadership, executive leadership. They have to trust it. They have to trust their data with it. And most organizations, they don't, right? So it's culture that's the multiplier, not the tech, right? And so I talk a lot about workflows and the ability to implement this technology. And you can't do that if you don't have psychological safety and broad leadership that is able to surface a type of culture that creates that multiplier.
I love that because I feel like all we hear about is AI and that companies need to be doing AI, which means so many things and nothing at the same time.
Exactly.
And so, like, the culture piece, I think, it's really important, right? Because I think you're absolutely spot on with the fact that, like, you still need people to adopt the AI and processes and creative processes, right? Like, there is so much potential with AI workflows and stuff, but it's not. I love what you're how you're framing it in that it's like it's not just going to happen on its own. Like you
Yeah.
still need people to do it. So, like, staying with AI, like what do you think, as we think about this climate and culture of, carbon management and carbon awareness and things like corporate reporting, and we talked about the challenges with data and audit and all this kind of stuff. What do you think the role of AI is going to play in this carbon management space?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love technology. And I look at AI as a bit of a continuum. It's not new. We have compute power that is new, which means that we can run these algorithms a lot faster than we could in the past, but the algorithms themselves are quite old, right? And so from my standpoint, the fundamentals still hold true, right? Because if, to me, I keep kind of pointing to my Gen X status, but I wear my Gen X status with like a proud badge on my
I love
chest
it.
because we came from a time when you had to crunch the numbers. You had to understand what you were doing before you did it. Otherwise, the result wouldn't be the right thing, right? You
Yep.
wouldn't get the result that you needed. And so I think that, just like, I mentioned that as a geoscientist, that in school we used to say garbage in, garbage out. It is the same thing
Yeah.
with where we are in this new world, right? So data hygiene is number one. Having foundational data estate. When I was at Microsoft, I used to preach from the rooftops about data hygiene and having a foundational data estate. And I still say the same things, right? I think that that is probably one of the fundamental blockers that most companies into. I think number two is having clear workflows, right? Having the right permissions and governance around your data, and then having basic controls. Now, this stuff is boring. This isn't the fun with quantum computing, AI, large language model, buzzwordy stuff. But until those things exist in an organization, AI is just a faster way of being wrong.
Which is gonna be, as companies are looking at environmental disclosures,
Yeah.
which are a huge undertaking. You talked
Yep.
about some of those challenges of, again, data and audit and governance and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, if they don't put some of those things in place when public disclosures are necessary or their investors are calling for certain things that are then public and stuff like that, if it's not right, companies are gonna get in trouble. Like,
No,
so
absolutely. And I
yeah.
think that we're we're kind of rolling into this, it feels a little bit like a train wreck where you're kind of like, yeah, I can see it happening. Wait, like, we could kind of, and we've had some lessons of the past, in the recent past where we've watched these models kind of train themselves based off of, kind of public information. I think that that's part of where a lot of organizations are very hesitant into widespread ubiquitous use within their walls, because we don't have a good kind of control over the security, data management, master data management. Like, we don't have a good, most organizations that I have worked for do not have a good kind of tracking, tracing, of their data within their walls, an audit trail, right, where they can give very solid numbers and understand what happened, right? But, not everything is boom and doom. I think that AI, well, I'll say large language models, because AI is already a thing that is in widespread existence. But if we're talking about large language models and automating, I think that being able to use it for anomaly detection is fantastic. Being able to use it for estimating emissions where we don't have data is really great. Being able to use it for scheduling is massive, right? Being able to create scenario modeling, that's really big. Back in the day where I did a lot of geography, geospatial risk screening, like, I used to do that. I used to work in the Everglades, and we used to create models looking at fire hazards in the Everglades, and then also some of the
Wow.
temperature risks. And so that we used AI back in the day. It took us a long time because we don't have the compute power that we have today. Those type of things AI is perfect for. And being able to, run some of these automations across those spaces is really important. However, we need to have security rails. We need to have rules in place and controls, and we need to get control of our data hygiene.
Mm. Yeah. No, I love that. And again, this emphasis that these models and stuff are really, at the end of the day, they're tools.
Yeah.
Some of them might be very efficient tools, but they're still just tools. They're not going to necessarily replace everybody. Um, so last couple of things before we jump out. So, like, as you're kind of working with lots of companies, you talked about lots of different sectors and industries that you're looking at and working with and stuff like that. Like, other than AI, like, what kind of like new technology and decarbonization and clean tech and some of that kind of stuff are you really excited about that you're sort of starting to see through some of the work you're doing? And yeah, really kind of keen to dive into kind of that kind of side of it.
Well, I think that, like, other than, some of the AI driven optimization stuff, which I kind of talked about a little bit, I think that's interesting. I think that, from a clean technology perspective, I really like, what I'm seeing around virtual power plants, VPPs, and some of the load flexibility. So, I live in Houston, and I grew up in Southern California. And so, I have a real vested interest in how we can really think about some of the flexibility around this idea of load sharing, and especially in the commercial and industrial space, as we start seeing these large assets that suck up a lot of energy, and also as we're starting to look at battery aggregates, looking at EV charging space, and what this kind of demand response looks like. The idea of bringing virtual power plants into the picture is really interesting, and I also really like how we think about the construct of a prosumer and being able to, have your own, be able to, have your own energy that you're producing for your house. And then during peak demand, being able to sell that back to the grid. We saw that happen in California recently. And it's a really interesting concept. And I'm watching it play out, and I'm really excited about that. And I think one of the other things that I'm excited about now, I'm going to get some people looking at me sideways when I say hydrogen. But I am excited about some new startups that I'm working with that have some real interesting solutions around fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells, some real interesting technology around combined heat and power, being able to pair it with on-site electrolyzers, and then also being able to look at how you can use hydrogen combustion for mining of helium off planet. So there's some real
Some
interesting.
really cool stuff. Like,
Yeah, it's some of the I'm one of these people. I'm going to sound weird, but I'm one of these people. I work with a lot of startups, and some of the startups that I'm sitting as an advisor and working within them. I'm a real believer. I'm one of these people. I hear these founders and they have this like amazing technology, and I'm like, I'm in. I'm all in. And so there's a startup that I'm working with that has this amazing hydrogen combustion technology, and they are looking at doing some off-planet mining for helium to be
that's
able to power
incredible.
this crutch that we're needing for some of our technologies.
For
But
helium, yeah.
uh,
Helium often doesn't get a lot of, attention, but it's difficult to find naturally, and stuff. I've done a little bit of work in that space, but yeah, really interesting. It's used in a lot of, instruments and stuff like that that people don't always often think about, particularly in the medical space and stuff like that, that it's not
exactly.
just for filling up balloons and making
No,
your voice
no,
sound
it's
funny.
yeah. Well, and also for fusion too. That's one of the
Mm,
other spaces that we're looking at. But yeah, I mean, it's
very
just
cool.
no, I'm really excited about it. Like I said, I'm a believer,
Yeah.
and I think that this type of technology will change the world.
Yeah, I love it. So as we kind of wrap, like, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really curious, like, what kind of things, other than some of the startups and stuff, is there anything else that's like on your radar that you're keeping an eye out on and looking out for, or is it just continuing to look at your startups and work with them?
You mean as far as just sectors or just like kind of spaces that are growing and
Just
and
yeah, spaces that you're really interested in and seeing growing and things like that that are popping up.
yeah, I mean, I think that like just like everyone, I'm really looking at the data center space quite a bit
Yeah,
and looking at what infrastructure looks like for that. I think that the dark horse in the data center space is going to be around water stewardship. So I am looking at different companies and startups that have an interesting play around water and data centers. And then I think that the other space, I'm still an infrastructure wonk at heart, so that's why I care a lot
love it.
about how the actual physical footprint of these places. I think the other thing is just kind of the built environment and these very real assets that were I think that land land and our resources is where we're sitting at right now as far as kind of climate and the things that are going to hit us the hardest. So I think quite a bit around some of the building standards that we have, some of how we look at it from a financial perspective, the asset valuation, and then also how this is translating into the market from a climate perspective.
I love
Um,
that.
how we can really, kind of help our companies here, think about their P&L in terms of built environment and their physical assets.
Very cool. Lots of stuff to keep an eye on between the clean tech and all the startups and some of the infrastructure and things like that. So Dawn, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.